Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Crazy Cat Lady. I will discuss the criminal mind of Chris Watts and the concept of duality or split personality. This duality is called diabolical from the root word diablo, which means devil. In mental health terms, it may mean dissociative identity disorder or psychosis. Since Chris Watts has refused a mental health evaluation, we can only give it our best guess. I will address a few dualities that I recognize, such as the homicide-suicide duality, passive aggressiveness, or the nice guy versus murder duality, pre-murder kindness and post-murder grief, the organized versus disorganized model of murder, and the modern-day incel, meaning involuntary celibate, versus killer duality as well, which is a variation of the nice guy versus killer mentality. I'll be quoting from an article titled Pre-Murderous Kindness and Post-Murderous Grief by Hans von Hentig. The above-mentioned dualities are what Mr. Hentig would describe as, quote, undeveloped aspects of murder, the mechanics of murder, evolution of the murderous idea, and victimology, end quote. First, I will discuss the murder-suicide duality. When Chris Watts started to have murderous thoughts toward his wife and children, he should have called a psychiatrist. Homicidal people may be suicidal, and suicidal people may be homicidal. In the early 1980s, serial killer Paul Michael Stefani, also known as the Weepy Voice Killer, repeatedly called 911 after committing murder because he was afraid of prison and felt he would commit suicide if he was sent to prison. Here is an audio clip.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe it. It seems like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
Fire emergency.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one. Oh, my Jesus.
Stefani was apprehended after he was injured during an attempted murder, and he called 911 for medical help. His weepy voice was recognized. He was arrested and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He did not commit suicide in prison, but instead died of cancer after serving approximately 15 years of his sentence. By all appearances, and we cannot go by appearances when it comes to Chris Watts, Chris does not appear to be suicidal. He was never on suicide watch, and reports by prison guards specifically state that he denies suicidal thoughts when asked. My guess is that he doesn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of committing suicide, especially not the prison inmates who encouraged him to commit suicide and who booed him as he was transported from one area of the prison to another. He continues to play the nice guy role even in prison, and he impresses the guards as well behaved. Maybe Chris Watts is attempting to achieve trustee status so he can escape, but for the time being, he's in maximum security. This brings me to the passive-aggressive duality, or the nice guy, model husband versus murderer duality. Author von Henting, from the aforementioned article Pre-Murderous Kindness and Post-Murderous Grief, describes what he calls the psychological alibi. Quote, the murderer is bent on introducing the element of improbability into the hazy set of circumstances, end quote. As we all know, Chris Watts used a psychological alibi of being a nice guy and a model husband from the beginning of the investigation. "I am the kind of guy who would never hurt my wife," he said verbatim during the pre-polygraph interview. "Ask all my friends." And in fact, he was manipulating his and Shanann's friends because, according to Hentig, quote, "he knows that they will be questioned later in court," end quote. The nice guy psychological alibi is actually not uncommon. It was used by BTK serial killer Dennis Rader, who was a family man and the president of his church. It was used by family man and bodyguard Chris Coleman. It was used by happily married man and serial killer Gary Ridgway, and many others. The marriage itself is a delusion and a facade that enables them to commit crimes and evade suspicion. As I mentioned in a previous video, the marriage is a window curtain so that from the outside looking in, everything appears normal. Chris had a psychological alibi, and so began the evolution of his murderous ideas. He was known by all to be a nice guy, and this explains how he even began to think he could get away with murdering his family. Next, I will discuss the organized-disorganized duality. Law enforcement has a model for categorizing organized offenders versus disorganized offenders, and Chris Watts does not fit into either category neatly. He fits into both, which to me indicates another duality. I have posted a screenshot of the profile for organized versus disorganized killers. I believe Chris Watts' mental illness or dissociated state began with Nicole Kessinger. His fantasies for Kessinger became just as real as his marriage to Shanann. They were dual realities, which is diabolical. Although his nice guy facade indicates a high level of organization, when he was confronted with the reality of dead bodies, he rapidly deteriorated into a disorganized state. Thus, he fits into both categories, organized and disorganized. Law enforcement also pays close attention to how the suspect behaves after the death is discovered, or the post-murderous grief, as von Henzig describes it. Suspects have several different methods after the fact for diverting attention away from themselves. Chris Watts used an apathetic tactic, as though he was stunned, which would be understandable to investigators. Another post-murderous ruse, according to von Hentig, is, quote, "a furious outburst of violence which casts doubt in the mind of jurors," end quote. Ted Bundy used this strategy and it backfired. So did Drew Peterson, a police officer with four wives, convicted of murdering one and suspected of murdering another, then convicted of hiring a hitman to murder the prosecutor who put him behind bars. In 1 second, I'll provide an audio clip of Drew Peterson. It's a clip from my phone, so you won't be able to hear it very well, but you'll be able to recognize Drew from the obviously angry outburst. That was Drew Peterson screaming that he did not kill his wife Kathleen, and the woman who was ordered removed from the courtroom was his former sister-in-law, sister of the deceased, telling Drew Peterson, she said, "Yes, you did," and she called him a liar. Moving on, Chris Watts' pre-murderous kindness was false, and so was his post-murder grief. In an apathetic ruse, he pretended to be concerned, but not overly concerned. Shanann had gone on a harmless playdate. She just wanted to get away from the marital discord for a while. He told Nicole Atkinson not to call police, as if there was nothing to really worry about. He fiddled around on his phone while police were searching the house. When Nicole asked if maybe Shanann was at the pool, which was a very logical possibility, Chris showed no interest in going to the pool. He said it was too hot of a day for Shanann to go to the pool. He was glib, almost chipper, during his television interview, the Sermon on the Porch, as it is called. He felt no urgency or compulsion to decline the hours-long polygraph to search for his family instead. This apathetic ruse is known by the FBI. Other suspects might demonstrate exaggerated emotional responses, such as wailing or a failed heart attack. Post-murderous grief is just as significant to law enforcement as pre-murderous kindness. Just as his pre-murderous kindness was false, his post-murderous grief was false as well. I doubt Chris has any remorse at all. He regrets the day he sent Shanann a Facebook message instead of waiting for women, quote unquote, he didn't know existed before, like Nicole Kessinger. So far, I have discussed the dualities of homicide-suicide, passive aggressiveness, pre-murder kindness, and post-murder grief, and the organized-disorganized model of law enforcement. Lastly, I would like to discuss the similarity of Chris Watts to modern-day incel murderers. For those who don't know, incels are a group of involuntary celibate men who are angry at women they believe are ignoring quote-unquote nice guys such as themselves. In reality, they are not nice guys. In 2014, incel Elliot Rogers went on a killing spree with his motor vehicle because he could not get a girlfriend. He killed 6 people and injured 14 others, but first he killed 3 roommates by stabbing them to death. His car crashed and he was found dead with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Elliot previously described himself on YouTube as the Supreme Gentleman. His extremely narcissistic manifesto, titled My Twisted World, can be found online in PDF format. I read it, and I skipped over the early years. Once he reaches late adolescence, the extreme narcissism is clear in his writing. In 2018, Alec Manassian, a Canadian man, plowed down 10 people, killing them and injuring 16 others because he was angry that women chose bad guys instead of quote-unquote nice guys like himself. Elliot Rodger was his hero. Like Chris Watts, these nice guy killers are diabolical. Their fantasy world is just as real to them as the real world. They live in a dual reality. Before marriage to Shanann, the longest relationship Chris Watts had was 6 months, and he married at approximately age 25. So for quite a while, his life seems to have resembled the incel life. The most bizarre dissociation of all is that Chris never knew that evil men such as himself existed in the world. He told law enforcement that he never owned a gun. Apparently, he saw no need to protect his family from evil men such as himself. He may have been hypocritically opposed to gun violence. Perhaps he thought he could talk his way out of any trouble. But when it came right down to it, if there had been a gun in the house, it might have been Chris Watts who was dead instead of his wife and children. So this concludes my video on the diabolical mind of Chris Watts. Please like and subscribe and visit my channel for other videos you may not have seen. Thank you.